Welcome to the Blue Rose Task Force podcast, where we look deeply into Twin Peaks as a whole, one episode at a time, using the full scope of the show Twin Peaks and all its official media. We don't use the word canon, but we consider all official releases important because Lynch and Frost have approved their presence. And we welcome all input into the collective consciousness that is the Twin Peaks community and wider universe. This podcast is a watch along podcast for those who've seen all of Twin Peaks, including the third season, which we consider as we go along. Today, we are looking at the second overall episode of Twin Peaks, Episode 1, often known, depending where you look, as Season 1, Episode 2, or what the German regionalization team named Traces to Nowhere. I'm your host, John. First up, some bureau business. Elle will not be appearing with us today. Thanks to some in real life events, Elle will not be able to appear as often as originally intended on this podcast. Now she will be showing up about as often as a Gordon Cole or an Albert Rosenfield. While these circumstances, for the show anyway, are not exactly the most ideal, rather this than be in Philadelphia, as the saying goes. Also, last episode, I missed referencing Andreas Holskoff's article, My Dog Barks Some, Animalistic Sounds and Motifs in the Works of David Lynch. This would have worked out really nicely to add an extra layer or 7 to the conversation where we're discussing Bobby and Mike barking at James in the jail cell. Yet, I would only recommend now to go read it. Again, My Dog Barks Some, Animalistic Sounds and Motifs in the Works of David Lynch, Andreas Holskoff on 25yearslatersite.com and or tvobsessive.com. And my apologies in advance to Andreas. As far as the episode we're here to discuss today, it is Episode 1. Cooper begins Episode 1 hanging upside down in his great northern room, recording his thoughts to Diane, then notably meets Audrey Horne. At the sheriff's station, he briefs a mid-donut Harry on the day's agenda. Doc Hayward takes them through Laura's autopsy. They question James Hurley, talk with Ed, and release Bobby and Mike with a warning. Leo throws his laundry at Shelley, who hides a bloody shirt from said laundry, and later he learns it's missing and hits her with a soap and a sock. Pete serves Cooper and Harry some fishy coffee while he questions Josie, who is in process of being double-crossed out of her mill by Ben and Catherine. And Donna visits the Palmers, where Sarah sees Laura's face over Donna's before having a vision that includes Bob's first official in-show appearance. Hawk uncharacteristically loses track of the one-armed man, Audrey gets chastised by her father, Bobby's cigarette lands in a meatloaf, and Cooper tries his first piece of Norma's cherry pie while learning Margaret's log as a witness. And while James is having dinner at the Haywards, Jacoby listens to a tape from Laura while holding the missing half-heart necklace. Now that we know what we saw, let's see what kind of questions we have now that we're revisiting this episode after absorbing all of the 2017 variety Twin Peaks. What's left to consider? Is Dale already tuned to the Red Room? Are there signs of other timelines or frequencies? What's going on with Sarah Palmer and the Palmer house? What kind of presence is Laura Palmer? What does the soundtrack and sound design do to the show? And how does delusion relate to the reality of Twin Peaks? So before we go into those questions in depth, let's look at what we do know about the production of Twin Peaks Episode 1. Okay, considering the production of Twin Peaks at the time, it's summer 1989. Twin Peaks has been renewed, or it has been greenlit to become an actual miniseries at this point, 7 episodes. That was kind of the mid-range of what they were expecting if ABC decided to make this thing official. So it's summer 1989, a number of months after the pilot had already been recorded. There is a warehouse in Van Nuys, California, and that is where all the sets were going to be relocated because they couldn't film up in the Washington area. Lynch, by this point, had already, he was hedging his bets whether or not this thing would ever get picked up in the first place. So he actually started another project that would become Wild at Heart. And while Lynch was working on that stuff, Frost did the day-to-day running of Twin Peaks. So the normal TV model of the day was basically crank out episodes like they were sausage, make them look about as identical and as easy to get into as you could possibly do, whether you're watching this for your first episode or your last. Without streaming, you were kind of at the mercy of whatever was on your TV set. So it made sense that you wouldn't want to mire yourself down in a whole bunch of backstory. But with the way Frost and Lynch wanted to take care of things, they wanted to continue what they were doing, which was look a lot bigger. Frost thought of these next 7 episodes as chapters of a novel that would be continuing the story from the pilot. He basically he's even quoted in Reflections by Brad Dukes, basically saying, "Let's make a 9-hour movie." So set designer Richard Hoover got hired because he had seen the pilot episode of Twin Peaks being played at one of those presentations to try to get the show turned into a series, and he all he was doing was calling up Mark Frost to congratulate him on a job well done, and Frost, he's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And Hoover does small talk or whatever, and then Frost says, "No, what are you doing now?" And he knew, based on their connections back in Minnesota, that Hoover was going to be the man for the job here. And it worked out really nicely because he was the one who basically transitioned all of the Washington stuff into the set in the warehouse in California. He insisted on real wood being used, which helped out immensely with the vibe of everything. And like when you're a regular viewer in 1990, you might not even notice that some of this stuff was actually filmed in California. But Hoover was still only able to do so much because to show how much room they actually had on this set or on this lot for all the sets, you got to figure there was that one really narrow hallway in the One Eye Jack set where everybody was, yeah. Well, that narrow hallway is basically the only amount of One Eye Jacks that they were able to fit in the warehouse. So that explains exactly how tight all this stuff is. Um, One other thing though that made it an interesting um, an interesting job to work on, besides having all this authentic Twin Peaks sets, the directors were included in the post production, which it didn't happen back then. It's like in 1990 you'd get a whole bunch of directors. They'd shoot their episode within like 6 days to 10 days or something, and then they just walk away and go on to their next job. But in Twin Peaks, they wanted every director to kind of feel, they wanted each director to have a whole bunch of freedom, just like David Lynch does, where you go in and you can even design the sound design, which I'll get to in a minute. Um, yeah, like it's interesting. Like, they were allowed to move scenes around if it fit the vibe of the episode better. And yeah. As far as the first director, Duwayne Dunham, he was the editor on Wild at Heart, and the only reason why he got that job um, instead of the job that he was set to do was, um, so Dunham had already recorded the pilot. I mean, he was already the editor on the pilot with Lynch, and then Lynch hadn't figured out Wild at Heart yet because he's the impulse hadn't happened yet. So Dunham got a different job, and then the only reason why he got called back is because Lynch dangled this thing out. It's like, well, how about okay, yes, you can direct an episode if this thing goes to series. So Dunham did actually get his directing gig that he gambled on when he said, "Okay, I'll work on Wild at Heart," and he actually had to leave his editing position on Wild at Heart for a little while he directed and did post production on his episode, which is this one, episode one. And then when he finished, then he went back to Wild at Heart work while Lynch finally got done with enough Wild at Heart work that he could film episode two near the end of the whole Twin Peaks production. That's a whole thing that we'll get into probably next Blue Rose Task Force episode. As far as how Dunham actually filmed this episode, he was the guy who edited the pilot. So as far as directors go, like who else were you going to get if you couldn't get Lynch himself to direct this first episode? You had to get everybody kind of back on the program, back in the vibe. And Dunham did a really good job with that. Um, what he did as far as shooting goes is he examined the style of the pilot and decided that he was going to use the same kind of thing. And the pilot ended up being the template for all of the season one episode and much of the series as a whole. Um, as far as the actual style of the pilot episode and what would end up being most of the first season and second season, um, Dunham kind of figured out this about the pilot, and he filmed like these straight shots. Um, he says they're framed pictures, and stuff happens in those frames. He said that on the DVD commentary from 2001. Um, so Dunham basically shot these static frames and he'd put in like maybe a little camera push, but that's about it. And that's all Twin Peaks needed because they really are like it's really interesting how things really are kind of moving paintings in a way. Now, getting back to that, directors are included in the post production. Part of what they're included in is the soundtrack itself. Like, there's no set soundtrack either. That's all up to the directors. And per Tim Hunter on that same Artisan DVD commentary, he says that Badalamenti had about 200 music cues made for the shows rather than like tracks. And there was a woman named Lori Eschler who knew the library better than anybody, and she worked with every single director to mix those cues together. You know, sometimes she'd like play them in reverse or slow them down or speed them up. And it was up to each director and her to like create a brand new vision. And in this case, whether it was intended or not, these cues, I mean, assembled as they are, they basically link Dale Cooper and Audrey Horne together because oh boy, because of the Dance of the Dream Man kind of cues and Freshly Squeezed are essentially the same theme in different instruments. And playing that together at the very beginning of the episode when Dale and Audrey meet and have all those fireworks, um, it's just it's an intuitive way to kind of make the audience, maybe accidentally, maybe on purpose, like really believe in those two as like a one true pairing. Between that and the fact that in 1990 it was still okay to have a leading man be romantically entwined with somebody like 20 years younger than them or whatever. Like look at any Cary Grant movie or whatever. That was still like a completely accepted ethos back then. So I mean, between that and the music, I wouldn't be surprised if that's why there's so many people being okay with a FBI guy trying to be involved with a school age girl, which luckily later on Kyle MacLachlan basically said no to, and there's a whole bunch of controversy. But I'm just kind of putting my line in the sand where, um, to modern or to younger viewers, like why this was kind of a thing that, people were okay with. Um, yeah. So, anyway, the end result of this episode after it was created was on April 12th, 1990, the first Thursday after the series premiered as a Sunday night movie. The viewership ratings were about 2/3 what they were for that pilot episode, which was, huge numbers. It's still really good though. It did admirably well against even Cheers, which was the number one show of the whole of America at that point. Cheers actually was at its lowest ratings of the whole year against that Twin Peaks episode. So I would say that's a pretty good dent. The only episode that was lower than that for Cheers was the one that aired on Thanksgiving, when I'm pretty sure a lot of people were choosing to watch football instead. So, yeah, good on you, Twin Peaks. So, now that we're done looking at the production history and what people were thinking of at the time when they were creating the episode, now it's time to look at what David Lynch had to say after Twin Peaks was dead as a doornail, in these 1993 Log Lady intros. Back when it was commonly understood that that would be the final word on Twin Peaks. And he did these for the Bravo network, and when Twin Peaks was airing in syndication. I carry a log, yes? Is it funny to you? It is not to me. Behind all things are reasons. Reasons can even explain the absurd. Do we have the time to learn the reasons behind human beings' varied behavior? I think not. Some take the time. Are they called detectives? Watch and see what life teaches. So, I mean, it's kind of an aphorism in a lot of ways, but it's basically, as far as I'm concerned, it's basically a thing where Lynch is saying, don't expect things to be rushed along or understood right away. Um, the is it funny to you? It kind of riffs on the fact that Lynch can find this humor and this darkness all at once. I mean, things can be funny like non sequiturs, but maybe not as funny if you can understand what you're seeing. So there's there's always reasons somewhere, whether we know it or not at the time. And I think it's a nice thing to keep in mind at the beginning of a journey. Now that now that the show proper has kicked in. Um, Another thing with Lynch saying some take the time, and are they called detectives? Are the detectives the one that take the time, watch, and see what life teaches? So my take on what Lynch thinks of as a detective isn't like the data crunching, figure out the answer kind of stuff necessarily. He's more of a, with time, detectives see what life teaches, whether that be, a standard detective thing or whether it's a little more esoteric. I think Lynch's message here is basically settle into the show and become a detective. Take the time, learn the reasons behind things by experiencing them across time. Okay, so now we've looked at where the show was when it was created, where David Lynch was after it was created, and then now I'm going to start by interpreting what we have seen in episode 1 based on all the elements that we've seen since then, like from Secret History all the way through Final Dossier, which means, yeah, everything that Lynch and Frost did in season 3. How to rationalize that with the original Twin Peaks? I mean, they seem absolutely alien, but there is a certain amount of commonality here. And I think most of that has to do with the fact that Lynch has established the tone for Twin Peaks, and therefore like all these things that he was trying to include in season 3 were always kind of baked in but left a little mysterious or unconnected so that there can be connections later. And I'm not trying to say that I'm right. I'm not trying to say that any of this was actually intended at the time, because most of it wasn't at all. um but it's pretty rewarding, and it's kind of nice for the people that are like, Twin Peaks season 3 or The Return isn't my Twin Peaks. It might be kind of nice to build a bridge between them as I do this. So the first thing to consider is Dale already in the red room? And, there's this thing, like, where once you're in the red room, you've kind of always been in the red room, and I'm exploring that kinda thing so that, it's like, can you make a case that Dale's always been connected to this weird ethereal force? So, where I land on this is he's getting tuned to where he's going to be with the dream in the next episode. It's like you can kind of see that he's a lot different than he was in the pilot. In the pilot, he was basically this noir guy, and you know, he he um he had these observational skills, but he was disconnected. Like he was a little bit back here compared to everybody else. Like, you're not quite sure um how he really felt about, even people necessarily. It's like he got all this glee on his face when he was trying to get that letter out from under Laura's nail. It's like he was kind of hard to get to in the pilot. But in this one right away we get this monologue where he's hanging literally upside down, and they go down, like they go from the room all the way over to Dale, and then like it takes a while to get to his face. And I mean, I don't know if this was intentional or not. I know that McLaughlin said that he intentionally wanted to take joy, like more joy, like maybe he'd be more into the people that he was talking to than the case itself, and it shows here. So I mean, that was partly McLaughlin's acting choices, but also, I mean, he's literally being turned upside down um, in order to kind of get to this approach that Dale is now being with everybody. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, and he notices things where he goes into the sheriff's department, and he sees three people eating donuts, including Harry, and he's like 3 for 3, just having fun, talking with everybody and experiencing everybody. And he goes through this entire day, and he takes little breaths, and here he's eating this donut this whole time while he's getting this massive info dump that's happily delivered by Cooper. And then he says, and I really have to urinate at the very end of it. Like Cooper is literally an entire human experience all in like the first 2 minutes of this episode. As far as how that figures into like Cooper being tuned to different frequencies or whatever, that's a little harder to nail down, so I'm not gonna try to do that. I mean, I I'm only gonna do so much, fan fiction adjacency here, but, it is also a pattern that we're gonna notice, like with Albert. The first time he appears, he's all, "Roar," and then, like, eventually he kind of warms up to everything as well. Like, he starts making a joke in season 2, and, it's like as people experience Twin Peaks, they start to kind of warm to it. And the characters that are established at the very beginning are not necessarily the ones that we get at the end. So I really do see that outsiders do change the frequency of people. Outsiders, the frequency of outsiders is changed by being in Twin Peaks over time. So, how does that figure into, are there signs of other timelines or frequencies? Well, another weird thing that ends up happening is like, the Sarah Palmer house. There was a house the house interiors are from a house in Everett, Washington, but that exterior establishing shot is from Monroe, Washington. It's a completely different house that we see in the series whenever we get an establishing shot of the house. Um, so like there's these things that we kind of have to rationalize because the actual house's exterior, the Everett, Washington house that the Reavers own now, that is what we get to see in Fire Walk with Me and in season 3. So like there's these interesting changes that happen, almost like the houses get recast, or like there's a thing over it. I mean, I know Lynch. makes points of like continuity when it comes to the sets because in this episode there's also like a repairman with a ladder fixing something in the sheriff's station to kind of explain to the viewers that might notice the differences um, that the sheriff's station has been recast. Um, but like the outside exterior of the Palmer house hadn't actually been established yet because back in back in the pilot, you actually never got to see the exterior of the Palmer house, which is interesting. You know, was it ever shown from the outside? No. No, the very first shot we see of the Palmer house is from the inside with Sarah in the kitchen. Then the next time we go in there, it begins with the photo in the living room of Laura Palmer, and then it pans from that. And and then after that, the very last scene we see with them is Sarah on the couch right before she sees the gloved hand grabbing the necklace. Um, we see her and Laura's photo in the same proximity, and so basically, the the exterior issues with Sarah and Leland were so strong that, like, it almost superseded the exterior of the Palmer house in the pilot, which I think is kind of an interesting thing all by itself. Because Lynch did give establishing shots in the pilots, but he made sure not to use the one for the Palmer house. Um, so yeah, it's almost like if you wanna say something about it, the exterior of the Palmer House and Fire Walk with Me, and then seeing it again in season 3, it's almost like you could say there's a mask over the house, masking the pain or what was really going on, throughout season 1 and 2 of Twin Peaks. The only other thing with frequency that I would say is here already in episode 1 is the color blue. And I know Lynch has a huge thing about using blue sparsely, but in this case, he totally approved it. And you know, like Uli Edel from season 2, he was a director there. He got shot down for using blue, so you know this was an approved thing by Lynch that Dunham did here. That blue hallway. First of all, Hawk sees Philip Gerard get out of an elevator through one of those convex mirrors that you have in hospitals to see around corners. So, you know, whether you call him Mike or Philip Gerard, the one-armed man walks out of the elevator through a mirror and walks all the way to this entirely blue lit room, or it's a hallway. And, you know, Hawk walks through the door, sees this bathed in blue area. And, you know, it's like to the morgue, the oxygen storage, and, and that's where Gerard was walking toward. So like this whole blue thing, it was a threshold, and the blue kind of told me that it was something to do with Laura, and that to step into that, you probably would have to change your frequency a little bit. And at that time, Hawk was not able to do that, and he wasn't even thinking about doing it. So as far as what would be considered an anchor scene in episode 1, I would probably say that it's the one where Donna visits Sarah Palmer. Um, and that that definitely leads into what is going on with Sarah Palmer and the Palmer house. Um, First thing I noticed is there are 0 mirrors present, like not even at the end of like not even corners of the room, like no mirrors at all. That probably means something. Um, Leland snaps Sarah out of her daze to announce Donna, first of all. So Sarah's like definitely in her own world inside her head. And basically all she can say to Donna is variations of I miss her so much. So she's looping. Um when she touches Donna's hand, she'll then see Laura's face on top of Donna, and then she throttle hugs Donna, and on repeat she basically says my baby," over and over. Um, and during this hug, she's staring straight ahead, while, Donna's like really close to her. And eventually Sarah Palmer ends up seeing the vision of Bob by the base of the bed, that famous crouching image. Obviously we don't know who Bob is yet, but that orchestra hit, that kind of that really in your face music cue kicks in, and Sarah is screaming. And the while these explosions and screaming continue, eventually she's held by Leland. So, like, it's just interesting to see how Sarah can experience these sort of other frequencies in a lot of ways. It's not exactly just seeing the future. It's not about it's more about knowing things. It's like last episode, she listens to the sounds of things. And like last episode she could hear people upstairs, who's upstairs, and like she says, I could tell from the sounds that it wasn't her. So like she's intuitive beyond so many things, but I do wonder if I mean there's the frog bug and the psychicness, and I know Elle was planning on digging into this, where it's like you've got to wonder about that frog bug being the cause of this, or being at least an antenna of it, because I know she kind of knew things before the frog bug crawled into her mouth too with the boy. Um, so Sarah, I think, is a strong receiver, and I almost wonder if something like the frog bug is making her a strong sender as well. Before I dig into that, you almost have to also wonder if the ghost of Laura is kind of haunting Sarah. Like, maybe it's through the frog bug, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. There's so many ways that you could connect this, that it's reasonable to consider this, that's also happening. But more than anything, I think the gifted and the damned are able to see things. I think Sarah is gifted and the damned all at the same time with all of this. So as far as Sarah, that establishes that she has more than more than reasonable reasons to be connected into this lodge spacey frequency. Um, as far as Donna being tied into this scene, earlier in the episode with her mom, she's talking about how she's simultaneously in a dream and a nightmare. They ended up, Donna's parents say they were letting her sleep longer because she was crying in her sleep. So she has this thing that she's not dealing with in the waking world too. Um, and then she says stuff like, "Mom, it's so strange. I know I should be sad, and I am. Part of me is, but it's like I'm having the most beautiful dream and the most terrible nightmare all at once." So in a way, she's kind of divided too. I mean, she confesses to her mom that Laura had a secret boyfriend, and it was James, and that James was great for Laura. But then she admits this truth to her mom, that they realized all this time they were the ones falling in love. So I feel I feel I've betrayed my best friend, and if that's true, then why am I so happy? So she gives this vulnerability to her mom, and she's open to this truth. It's interesting how that turned out to be a fine experience, but then when she doesn't understand what's going on, and like she's not able to witness the truth, like, it's almost like, is Sarah a strong sender and able to imprint on Donna because of how she's connected to all this? Or yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that we'll be looking at over the course of this podcast, and this is definitely one of those things that I like to keep an eye on. Um, so yeah, and I mean, it's any scene where the three main people who knew that Laura was dead before anybody told them they were dead. Laura, I mean, oh my gosh, Donna, Sarah, and Leland all in a room together and all kind of on that frequency. I mean, these scenes are worth paying attention to big time. Um, And then, of course, like the super creepy part that we didn't know was creepy at the time was how Leland is the one comforting Sarah at the end, almost like she's allowed to look away. So we already looked at certain parts of Laura, like, like, is she haunting Sarah, that kind of thing. But what kind of presence is Laura Palmer is definitely worth asking for a long time in this show. In this particular episode, first of all, we get Doc Hayward talking about Joe Fielding's autopsy report to Harry and Cooper. Um, there was a lot of loss of blood, and that reminds me of "Don't Sell Your Blood" that Carl Rod tells Crispin, I believe his name was, one of the Deer Meadow one of the Deer Meadow residents, um, in, I think it was part 10 of Twin Peaks, but anyway, it was part of the return, and it's like all these in this particular episode, there's the numerous shallow wounds, no single one of them serious enough to cause death. And it's like this cumulative trauma. It's a cumulative loss of blood. Like over time, the blood will, I mean, it'll kill you if you give up enough of yourself. And the cumulative trauma also to me implies it's not just one thing with abuse. It's like over and over. It's the repeating, it's the circling, it's the cycle. Um there's also bite marks, the shoulder and the tongue. That's an internal and external wound all at the same time. Thematically, on purpose, maybe, but definitely thematically relevant. Um, being tied up with twine, that's a clue for the for the plot story that they have to tell in season one as well. And the three men, there's a reference to the third man, which is one of those famous noir movies. Um, in name only. It's just, for the vibe, I would imagine. Um, so yeah, we don't get much of Laura personally there, but it's like the physical effects on Laura Palmer. That's what we see. Um, the second instance that I'm gonna say is how there's there's the Jacoby tape at the end, the recording of the voice, and I kind of think Joel Bacco, he has Lost in Twin Peaks. It's a podcast that like really deep dives into the production history and everything. If you're at all interested in that stuff, I definitely recommend his podcast. I use it for every single episode of this to check my work to make sure that I'm not like saying anything too wacky about, history of the show. And yeah, he implied that the flashback with James where Laura actually speaks to him is probably a production thing so that we will know that it's Laura's voice at the end that we're hearing when Jacoby's listening to the tape. Um, Now, as far as the tape itself, um, what will end up happening is in episode 7, the season 1 finale, it's going to be re-recorded and listened to in a completely different location by James, Donna, and Maddie. And it's going to have a completely different tone to it, which is interesting to me that they would do that. I mean, from a production side, it's probably because Cheryl Lee only recorded maybe a little bit further on than we got in episode one, and they hadn't quite written out um, the full tape that we were going to get in episode 7. So she had to re record for continuity purposes. I mean, it makes sense that way. But being Twin Peaks, being multiple frequencies, being a lynch joint where like one person can be a completely different name and person later on as you go. Things like that are worth noting. And being from Laura, being Laura's voice, that you could find ways to make that mean something easily. As far as that James flashback, I mean, I in season 2, one of the things that really threw me was when Andy had that vision of little Nicky where we see, in Nicky in a devil costume, like in the side of his head, and like this inset window, and it's like of all the things, like why in the world are we getting flashback, or why are we getting images like that? Yet here we are in the first episode. I guess it must be that it was more organic or less established, but it's already established that we get the interior view of what actors I mean, what characters are seeing inside their own heads. Um, I know that, Duwayne Dunham in that DVD commentary, he said that that flashback scene was James's retelling of what occurred. And anybody who has read Secret History or, watched Lost Highway, remembering things the way you want to remember them tends to take a visual life of its own. And yeah, it's funny that yeah, James's oversimplified look into who Laura was there, and presented so silly. I mean, like he smells so sweet, and yeah, it's, oh, poor James. he's a he's a little lamb. So the only other instance we get of Laura in this episode is when they show that one image of her close up from the video recorded on top of the mountain, and it's her face like paused, and we hear her say, "Help me," which is really crazy. Like that doesn't figure into anything that we've ever seen. Yeah, it's I mean, was that the only other time I can see that it might actually, coincide with something is that one vision when Gordon Cole was free drawing that antelope-looking character with the arm reaching in from off screen, and then he sees that desperate Laura, um, at the doorway asking, it's like, "Are you my friend, Donna?" From Fire Walk with Me. So, like, that pushed through then. So is the help me scene pushing through now? You can make a case for it. Was that Laura's presence pushing through lodge space into the foundation of the show and being unseen by everybody within the show? And was that just for us? Like was it just there to add a vibe? Or could you actually say that this is actually Laura reaching through the veil? It's there to be had. Okay, so back to sound design. What does the soundtrack and sound design do to the show? So again, about listening to the sounds with Sarah from the last episode, and what I already talked about with the soundtrack cues with Audrey and Cooper. Um, there's also this interesting thing about Audrey in general. Audrey's dance is a completely different cue than Freshly Squeezed. It doesn't have the same Cooper motif exactly, but it does have the same foundation as Dance of the Dream Man. And I know that Lynch and Badalamenti actually did write this song as an actual thing for Audrey because of how they make her dance to it in the next episode. We'll get to that, but this was actually a designed song rather than one of those things that Dunham put together in post production. So you have the same thing. The love theme and Laura Palmer's theme are the same motif there, and you can hear some of Laura Palmer's theme in this. It kind of comes over the top of the freshly squeezed drum, the shuffling drums and all that. The bass line is there from Freshly Squeezed, but it's also Laura Palmer's theme. So it's interesting how Audrey has this foundational thing where she's both Laura and Cooper's worlds, and yet she was never actually involved in the any of the lodge space stuff until season 3. So, like, I don't know, it's there's something to that, and I will probably come up with a little stronger answer as I go, but I really wonder um, how much of Twin Peaks' fascination with Audrey has to do with Sherilyn Fenn, and how much of it has to do with the music, and why both of those put together make her such a special character, even while Lynch and Frost tend to just kind of think of her as just one other character in their sandbox to play with. Okay, so the last question that I'm going to be considering today is, how does delusion relate to the reality of Twin Peaks? So, as far as delusion goes, that could be any number of things. It could be looking away from, the white horse is the white of the eyes, just like that. The white of the eyes is what you show when you're looking away from the thing you should be looking at, or that, you need to be considering. There's that. So, there's ways that you could see that with Sarah right now, but we've already talked about that sort of thing. This category is more about like how we see like the lodge spaciness adjacency of Twin Peaks within everybody else in Twin Peaks too. Like, why does the uncanny work so well in Twin Peaks? It's because it's everywhere. So we see it in head injuries. Lynch has the thing with head injuries, and I'm assuming it's like, you get hit, your electricity gets like shook around inside your head, and like, new paths form, that kind of thing. So you've got Ed. Ed has a head injury after he was drugged, and drugs are another thing that we'll be talking about. But yeah, Ed has the head injury by the way of Bobby or Mike. And then Johnny Horn last episode, Ronette scene from the pilot. Um, so Doc Hayward talked about how Ronette has a severe head injury, psychological impact, fear, and then not to mention that she witnessed what was happening to Laura. So symbolically, you could say that the head injury came because she couldn't deal with what she witnessed that happened to Laura. Um, with Audrey and Ben, there's I lost you years ago. Laura died 2 days ago. I lost you years ago, and that losing Audrey gave me a reminder of how Norma's father was lost in secret history. And Frost makes a point in Final Dossier to say that um, while Norma's dad was lost, that doesn't mean he was dead. So, lost you years ago, different frequency, barriers between people. Definitely, that's where we're starting with Audrey and Ben Horn. Uh, Next up, we've got the the Briggs dinner scene with that crazy opera in the background, because Duwayne Dunham used the opera that had nothing to do with Badalamenti because he wanted to make these crazy stakes that Bobby is living through. And he doesn't say a word to his parents. His parents are like, his dad is going on this thing, talking about, responsibility and, like open a dialogue and all these great things to hear. Except Bobby is like the whole time, it's like this is where the cigarette gets slapped out and into the meatloaf. And he's basically thinking, like, "Oh, what family am I part of?" And like, it's this interesting way of like hyper explaining or like hyper experiencing this thing that Bobby is experiencing in his own head, of just like, who are these people? Um, so you could make a case that like he's sort of in this other frequency too. And you can see that again with drugs. They're talking about drugs in that jail scene where he refers to Mike as Snake and Snake refers to Bobby as Bopper. It's like that thing with the Great Wind and the zebra and like all these other nicknames. Like, nicknames are used by people who are typically using drugs at the time, which to me is another filter over what's really happening. It's like you're looking away into drugs, onto this other frequency that Lod space can kind of infiltrate. And the only other sense of delusion is a little bit more worldly because you have this set design thing with Shelley's house where her laundry is literally outside for anybody to watch. Like, so in that case, it's more about like there's all these things that she and Leo have to experience together. It's like the abuse. Um, the abuse is technically inside the house, but the house doesn't have complete walls. The house, it's like all the dirty laundry is outside for anybody to see if you walk around to the back of the house. It's all obviously there. So I'd say that is maybe less delusion, but more of how metaphor surfaces within Twin Peaks. All right, well that's about where I'm gonna stop for episode one. I mean, you can tie this into all the way up through the end of part 18 if you want to, but I think we're going to do that as we go, starting next week with episode two. So, you have been listening to the Blue Rose Task Force podcast, a production of Ruminations Radio Network and TV Obsessive. If you resonate with what you're hearing, please subscribe, rate, and review our show, and we would love to connect with you on Twitter at Blue Rose TF Pod and Instagram and Facebook at Blue Rose Task Force. You can find me at JPB_Little Green on Twitter and John_the_Peaky on Instagram. Visit ruminationsradionetwork.com for additional great shows such as Retrofuturist Culture and Cinephile Hissy Fits. Find any number of classic 25YL Twin Peaks articles and content on many other TV shows at tvobsessive.com. If you want to be part of our monthly mailbag Patreon episodes, send your burning questions and passionate feedback to Blue Rose Task Force Podcast at gmail.com. I'll see you next week as we cover episode 2, the third overall episode of Twin Peaks. And until then, listeners, I'll see you in my dreams.
And it's a mystery.
I wish you the best of luck.
It's a way to kind of deepen and expand the universe that the show takes place in. They'll really dig it. This is a gift to all the fans.